everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, then a little introduction. This is a place to share stories, adventures, and everything I wish I had known before embarking on them. My name is Drina, and you're watching From Fiji to Here. This has been the most highly requested video, and by far the hardest one to sit down and actually plan out and edit. But here you have it, folks. The budget breakdown for my 2.5-month trip in Europe. I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best way to go through all of this in hopes to give you as much content and depth as possible to help you with your future travels. This is likely going to be a pretty long video, so I have left timestamps below in the description to help pinpoint each section if there's only one or two things that you are looking for more information on. Also, a short disclaimer before we get into the meat of this video. This is how I budgeted for my own trip to Europe. There's a lot of factors that come into play from the beginning, such as your financial state back home, if you'll have other expenses to pay while on the road, what type of traveler you are, etc., etc. If this is the first video of mine you've seen, I'll explain that I'm not currently a full-time traveler and I do have expenses back home, including student debt, telephone bills, rent, etc. I describe myself as a mid-range spender in regards to traveling. I won't blink twice for activities or experiences that I deem non-negotiable in regards to the price of them, but I've also done my research ahead of time for those. But I'll find ways to cut costs with things like food and accommodation by eating at home or buying food from grocery stores to prep myself instead of eating out at a restaurant every meal, as well as staying in Airbnbs and hostels instead of hotels. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Welcome to the mothership, where all of the research that went into it beforehand from my end, I was in charge of budget, accommodation, transportation. Sierra had a separate document for all the activities and how to get from A to B, etc., etc. But this is where all of my research is located. The first thing I want to break down is that there are actually two spreadsheets to this document. The first one down here you have is the estimated costs, and then right beside it we have our actual costs. So the first part here where we're talking about all of the research that went into the actual spreadsheet, that was all put in the estimated so that we knew what to budget, how much money we'd have to save, etc. And then the actual costs as the trip went on, we would update that every country or two to make sure that we weren't blowing all of our money at once and we weren't going to run out before the end of our trip. So before heading out on the trip, there were some one-time costs and savings that we had to incorporate that weren't necessarily applicable for both of us. So you can find my prices are all up here, and they are kept out of the way of the main spreadsheet so that they wouldn't be in Sierra's budget. The first one right here we have is the international driver's license. Because I was the primary driver for the trip, I wanted to make sure that I didn't have any troubles renting a car in any of the destinations we were going to. So I did get one of these just in case. It's good for a year. Definitely worth my money. The second one we have here is the 2-month Eurail pass. If you haven't seen my train travel in Europe video, this is a great chance to cue that to your list of next videos. The next thing we have is travel insurance. Luckily, we didn't end up in a situation where we needed to use it. However, it's never worth taking the risk. I may do a video on that later if there is any interest in seeing that. But for now, we'll just leave it at always get the travel insurance. A couple items that weren't necessary, but very much were planned and thought about and saved up purchases, such as the drone and GoPro. There's actually a video coming out later this month in regards to those, as well as my flight from Halifax to Toronto since we were leaving out of Toronto to head on the trip. Then, of course, as I mentioned, I don't currently travel full-time, and there are some expenses that need to be paid even though I wasn't going to be in the country. So we have things like my student loan while I was away, my phone bill, and rent. Getting down into what I would call the meat of the spreadsheet, each column represents its own country, since costs across Europe can vary tremendously, especially from north to south and east to west. So you can't get a very good estimate by just doing a blanket statement on how much food costs or accommodation costs will be. And then on the left side here, we have a standing legend for each row to make it easier when you're sliding down amongst different countries and whatnot. Going down the rows, you'll notice the first one we have here is the cost of transportation to leave the country or city and head to the next. You'll notice for planning purposes, above the country columns, it does say our mode of transportation. So for example, leaving Toronto was a plane ride, plane, train, etc., which just gives us a better idea of why some of the costs are so much higher. For example, the first one to Europe being a plane versus the one leaving Norway being a train. The second one here, we have intercity transport. This is the cost of getting to our Airbnb and around the city if it wasn't very walkable, or if it wasn't covered within our Eurail pass. So for example, in Paris, we had to purchase a metro pass in order to use the subways, but other times we used taxis like in Slovenia just because they were so much cheaper and kind of you got more bang for your buck, so it made more sense. For the most part, for flight estimates, I use Google Flights or Flight Hub to get an idea of the routes we're looking at, as well as the amount of time it will take, and then use that as a guideline for costs for that option. When we head down into this section here, the accommodations section, I guess, you're probably wondering why it looks so confusing. I'll skip down to Norway here, just since that's the first place we actually had booked accommodation. The great debate, hostels versus Airbnbs. Now, both Sierra and I weren't opposed to either option. However, we did want to make sure that we weren't overpaying for wherever we decided to stay. Something to keep in mind is that when you're booking hostels, you often pay per bed, whereas with Airbnbs, you pay per room. So if you're traveling with someone that you don't mind sharing a bed with, it could often be cheaper to stay in an Airbnb when splitting the costs. This is kind of what we found the case to be for most places on this Europe trip. Now, in order to get estimates for all of these, I started by heading to budgetyourtrip.com, one of my go-to travel planning websites. This is not a sponsored video, although I do wish it was. This amazing website has thousands of destinations that you can select the country, region, or city, your travel style, and which currency you're looking in, and will show you the average cost per day, as well as the breakdown for different categories such as accommodation, food, local transportation, etc. This is also where I got the food cost estimate here and our accommodation cost average per night, as well as the total once we considered how many nights we were staying. Then in order to do the comparison, I would then head to Airbnb as well as hostelworld.com and would use the search function with the dates that we planned on being there, the length of time we were staying, etc., and take the average cost for each option. This allowed us to have a baseline to go off of when booking our accommodation. If it was over the estimate amount that they were asking, we knew it wasn't worth the money for our trip purpose, and the totals just come from some basic calculations, as I mentioned, going through the number of nights and the average costs. You might notice that sometimes the Airbnb and hostel totals vary significantly from the average cost total. This is because when taking the numbers from Budget Your Trip, it doesn't account for what time of year you're going, whether it's high season or low season, etc. So Copenhagen here is a perfect example. We were there over Easter weekend, which is a long weekend and national holiday, so prices were on the higher end. Another example of this would be when we were looking at accommodation in Amsterdam, and you'll see the numbers here for a hostel especially have skyrocketed because we were there over King's Day, which is the national holiday. The next category that I briefly touched on is the food cost. A couple things to note with this. Our numbers were also taken from budgetyourtrip.com, then multiplied by the number of days we were in that city, not the number of nights. Be sure to count the number of days because if you don't, you're going to be skipping your travel day and you have to eat on those days too. The car rental category is pretty self-explanatory. We didn't rent a car in every city, obviously. However, there was enough to warrant putting that there so that we could properly split the cost between us. The last section here that we have is activities. The number of activities vary per country. It just kind of depended on what we had looked into, what we wanted to do. Some of them we had prices for, others we had no idea what the cost could be. And as you'll notice as we get further along, a lot of the prices weren't filled out just because we didn't book things in advance for later on. The next category up here, we have the city total. This would just tally up everything that we spent in that country. it really helped to know that if we had overspent on activities, we could just try and cut costs a little more in our food budget or by walking instead of taking a cab, etc. So yes, as I touched on, as we get further on, you'll notice that a lot of these weren't filled out. The prices weren't. This is mainly because we weren't positive what we wanted to do yet that far in advance, since it was like by the time we left, it still was 2 months away from some of our last destinations. But it was taken into consideration when we looked at a total trip cost down here. So when we looked at our total trip cost per person, we did round this number to $9,000 with a $1,000 emergency fund in case we had to fly home at any point in the trip. That's something I would advise for any trip you're taking. You'll also notice that my total here is higher just due to those initial expenses we talked about in the beginning of the video that Sierra didn't necessarily have or that weren't the same for both of us. Touching on the $1,000 emergency fund, for any trip you're going to take, I highly recommend that in addition to getting travel insurance, you have an emergency fund for a flight home. Check how much a flight would cost from your destination to fly home if you had to book it last minute, and then double it to take into account the last minute booking fee, as well as if there's high demand. Imagine if you had been in the middle of a trip when this current COVID-19 pandemic was called, and you had to book a flight back home before the border to your country closed. Makes sense now? Also, a lot of the time, travel insurance will reimburse you your funds if A, you've purchased cancellation interruption insurance, not just emergency medical, and B, you still have to pay the cost up front, and they'll often just reimburse you. So this goes along with a whole list of things to know before you go, which I can make a video about if anyone's interested. I hope this makes sense for the estimate portion of the spreadsheet. If there's anything that doesn't make sense, please do feel free to ask me. If everything goes according to plan, then this video should actually be a premiere, and I'm right here with you responding in the comments. Heyo! The final fun bit. Let's take a look into my actual budget. Yikes! So hopefully this isn't too complicated showing both screens. I just thought it would be an easier idea to get kind of like a side-by-side comparison of the estimate versus the actual. Keep in mind with this actual budget that these are my numbers. So Sierra's were likely different. She had her own expenses, and obviously with souvenirs, we didn't buy the same thing, and whatnot. A quick legend, pretty self-explanatory. Green means under budget, red means over budget, and yellow means close enough to budget, give or take $10. As you can see in the beginning up here, that planning in advance was a huge help. I was able to save on just about everything that we pre-purchased before we left. Some things that stand out are the almost $400 worth in savings for the 2-month Eurail pass, as well as the $300 in savings on the flight to Toronto. We were even able to save a little bit of money on our flight leaving from Toronto to get to Europe. However, if you have seen our Iceland video, you'll understand this big sore thumb right here, the $450.80 instead of $0. I'll link the Iceland video here to explain that for you. But essentially, our trip started 3 days later than planned due to the Reykjavik airport closure. And since our outgoing flight from Reykjavik wasn't technically canceled, where it was a layover, we ended up having to book a whole new last-minute flight from Iceland to Norway, which was a punch in the gut and put us out almost $500. See why it's important to have emergency funds? This put us in a huge red for this country. However, if you subtract that departure cost from the equation, we actually only ended up $30 over budget here. When we move on to the next country of Norway, we ended up in the green because we only spent a 1 night there instead of the original 3 that we had planned. So that kind of was a given, I guess. Sweden follows the trend that anything we could book in advance, such as the open air museum ticket and the boat tour, as well as our accommodation, we were able to save money. But when it came to things like taxis and train reservations, we just didn't have enough information before leaving. But we were able to save on food because of the easy accessibility to cooking in our Airbnbs. As we make our way through our countries, we seem to do pretty well. We did well in Copenhagen and even in Germany, and then we got to the Netherlands. And, well, I went over budget for King's Day. Doesn't look like much, but it did affect it. Belgium, we were good, and then we get to France. So I'll just sweep this one over so that we are updated. Why did France hurt us so badly? Well, let's start. We saved a little money on our accommodation here. I mean, it really wasn't that much. We're looking at maybe $50. However, the hit that we took in doing so was pretty painful. So because the Airbnb was so far from the inner city, we didn't realize that we would have to purchase a Metro Pass for our time there. Cha-ching. We also didn't consider the need for reservations to get us out of the country to Switzerland, which is just across here, as well as anywhere within the country. So our train to get to Vimy before we got our rental car. We also spent a lot of time here with family, which meant eating out more. And finally, the big ticket item down here that's not even highlighted, but should be, the $100 spent on mailing home a package full of souvenirs, articles of clothing we no longer needed, shoes that never should have come with me in the first place, etc. Switzerland also hit us pretty hard, as well as due to my geographical errors. We lost a lot of money on accommodations just by having to cancel one last minute and rebook one also last minute. If you don't know what I'm talking about, again, I'll link that video here. And then because of our train issues, it meant staying an extra night in Switzerland, and the overall exchange rate just wasn't great between the Canadian dollar and the Swiss franc at the time. As we head into Eastern Europe, a balancing act came around where our dollar went so much further than it did before. So we ate out more, shopped more, etc., which is how we kind of get into this yo-yo effect of being under budget, under, over, etc. So Prague we were under, Poland we were over, Hungary we were under, Slovenia under, Slovakia over, and you can kind of see where we're getting at here. Then we hit Italy, and we did pretty well in Venice considering we didn't have any accommodations, and even in Florence we did pretty well with all of the rain. However, we got to Rome, and then we fell sick, felt like crap, and splurged on a hotel, which right off the bat, if you look at the average accommodation in Rome, costs about $105 for the 3 nights we were there. We splurged and went to $350 to stay in a hotel just because we felt like crap, and we bought a lot of junk comfort food as well. And then again, we did well until we got to Portugal and fell in love with Lagos and decided to skip Lisbon entirely. So again, we had last minute accommodation changes that added up on our budget. We ended up paying for 2 accommodations one night. So that upped our costs there. In Ireland, this is where we start kind of falling off on updating the budget. You'll notice right off the bat that Ireland, we rented a car, which was something that we weren't sold on, so we have $80 here estimated. However, we didn't consider the young driver's fee. We definitely went over budget. We only had a couple countries left, and knowing that we had been under budget in more countries than we had been over budget, we focused a little less on the numbers and more on making the memories and living in the moment before heading home. And then Scotland and England, we didn't even end up updating the budget. So those are probably really bad estimates. Although the things we booked in advance, we did get a good deal on. So when we look at our totals in the end, our trip total each came to about $8,500. These are in Canadian dollars as well. That's not including the expenses from the last 3 countries, which I would guesstimate were about $600 to $700 per person, considering the gas for the car rental in Ireland that wasn't included in the spreadsheet, the buses to and from Glasgow, and eating out in both London and Scotland. As well as the Uber that's not included here to the Gatwick Airport. That was a cringe-worthy price. Overall, I would say, so if you remembered back to this estimate, we had estimated $9,000 here with $1,000 kind of emergency fund that we ended up touching into that's included in this price. So if we add the additional $600 to $700 onto here, we're looking at $9,200. Overall, I think we did pretty good in staying under our $10K budget for 70 days abroad, even with our mishaps and splurged activities, which you can see more of in our destination videos from each country in the playlist that'll come up at the end of this video. I hope this video somehow helps you plan your next trip, and if you'd be interested to see videos like this for future travels or long-term travels that may be happening in the future, do let me know. If there's any questions I didn't get to answering, I'll be here in the comments for a little while to answer any of them. And also, if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button to be notified of more like it, as well as to join me on my future journeys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next destination. Bye, guys!